She came only to sign the papers, but on the abandoned island with the old windmill, she discovered letters that changed her life and revealed a secret hidden for generations. Stay until the end. This story will touch you deeply. Subscribe and comment which city you're watching from. The rain had been falling since dawn, a steady gray curtain that blurred the city into an indistinct smear of concrete and wet pavement. In the cramped apartment where Mara lived with her son, the sound of water sliding down the windows was almost the only thing that reminded her the world outside still existed. She sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of weak coffee cooling between her palms, the steam rising like a fading memory. Across from her, the single-framed photograph on the wall stared back, her late husband holding their son when he was still small enough to curl against his chest. 2 years had passed since that day, but the wound had never learned how to close. Liam hummed quietly on the living room floor, clicking worn-out blocks together and constructing something that resembled a tower. He rarely asked questions about his father anymore, as though the silence had seeped into him as well. Mara watched him for a moment, that familiar tug in her chest, returning half tenderness, half guilt. Her days now were small, compressed into errands, part-time work at the accounting firm, a grocery list pinned to the fridge with a cracked magnet. She no longer made long-term plans. Even the future felt too heavy to look at directly. She turned back to the pile of mail she had ignored since yesterday. Bills, discount flyers, a late notice from the school about class fees. She sorted mechanically until her fingers brushed something unfamiliar, a heavy cream-colored envelope with her name handwritten in precise black ink. For reasons she couldn't explain, her stomach tightened. She slit the flap with the edge of a knife. Inside was a formal letter embossed with a crest from a law firm she had never heard of. We are writing to inform you of an inheritance pertaining to the estate of Mr. Severin, deceased, formerly of Lake Rootservie. The property consists of an island parcel and its remaining structures. You have been identified as the next of kin through your late husband. For a long moment, Mara simply stared at the words. The name Severin lingered in her memory like a half-forgotten story. Her husband's grandfather, a man he had mentioned only once, with a bitterness that revealed more than the story itself. He built boats for everyone, her husband had said, but never a home to come back to. "What is it, Mom?" Liam asked, peeking up from the floor. "An island," she said before she could think better of it. "Apparently, your great-grandfather's." His eyes widened instantly. An island, like with trees, and water around it, and maybe animals. She almost laughed. Probably just rocks and moss. But that night, as she tucked him into bed, he whispered question after question, what the island looked like, if there was a house, whether they could go. His voice carried an excitement she had not heard in far too long. And because she had no strength left to extinguish it, she told him softly, "We'll see." The next morning, Mara called the law office. The woman on the phone explained in a clipped, professional tone that the property could not be transferred without a personal inspection. The taxes had been prepaid from a small remaining account. The island had been untouched for years. By the end of the call, Mara found herself saying, "All right, I'll go." She didn't understand why. Maybe it was the exhaustion of her life in the city, the sameness pressing against her every waking hour. Or maybe it was simply the memory of her son's glowing face. 2 days later, Mara packed the old car and buckled Liam into the back seat. The road north stretched endlessly. Forest replaced buildings, pine replaced exhaust. The deeper they drove, the more the city peeled away like dead skin. Liam counted lakes that appeared between the trees. She kept her eyes on the asphalt, letting the hum of the engine fill the quiet. By midday, they stopped at a roadside cafe that smelled faintly of smoke and pine resin. An old man behind the counter poured them soup and coffee. When he overheard the name Severin, his eyes sharpened. "Sever's Island," he muttered, lowering his voice. "He came here sometimes. Strange old fellow, stubborn as winter frost. Wouldn't sell that rock even when everything else was gone." Mara nodded politely, expecting the conversation to end. Instead, he leaned closer. "They say he built something there, lived in that windmill of his like a ghost. After his wife died, he shut the world out. When they finally found him, he was sitting in that chair by the little window, watching the lake thaw. The man hesitated, then reached behind the counter. He laid a rusted iron key between them. "He left this here, said someone would come one day. Maybe it's you." Outside, the sky had deepened into pewter, the air sharp with cold. Mara didn't speak as she drove the last stretch to the lake, her fingers clenched tight around the wheel. The water appeared suddenly, a vast dark mirror rippling with wind. And in the middle, silhouetted like a forgotten memory, stood the island. A wooden pier jutted into the lake. Tied to it, a small rowboat, its lock corroded with years. The key turned easily, as if the metal had been waiting. They rowed in silence. The lake stretched wide around them, swallowing every sound except the dip of oars. Liam's excitement faltered, replaced by a reverence that she felt too. The world seemed to shrink to three things: the boat, the water, and the faint outline of the windmill rising from the island's center. When they reached the shore, wet moss cushioned their steps. Birch trees stood like pale sentinels around the clearing, and there, rising from the uneven ground, leaning as though time itself had pushed against it, stood the windmill. Its wooden frame was weathered silver, its broken lopsided blades frozen mid-turn, its stones mottled with lichen. But even in ruin, it had presence proud, solitary, refusing to fall. A shiver passed through her. They approached slowly. The door groaned open under her hand. Inside, dust swirled in the thin beam of light, slipping through cracked boards. The air smelled of old wood, oil, and years of silence. A small iron kettle hung near a rusted stove. Papers were scattered across a warped table. Liam darted from corner to corner, his voice echoing softly as he explored. "Mom! There's an attic!" She followed him up a narrow staircase. The attic was dim, cluttered with fishing nets, trunks, tools, and stacks of faded photographs. One photo made her catch her breath, a tall man with a beard, standing beside a small boy. The boy's face, wide-eyed, solemn, was unmistakably her husband's. She touched the edge of the picture, her fingers trembling. "That must be him," she whispered. That night they slept on the floor wrapped in sleeping bags, the wind sighing through the beams. Liam drifted off quickly. Mara stared at the dark ceiling above, listening to the lake's quiet breathing. Something in the stillness pressed against her chest, heavy, ancient, waiting. Dawn arrived gray and cold. Mist curled between the trees, and the island felt suspended between past and present. Mara stepped outside, the air biting her skin, and looked at the windmill again. It stood lonely and broken, yet somehow enduring. Maybe, she thought, this was where everything began again. And when Liam ran barefoot down the steps, laughing at the frogs by the shore, she realized with a kind of quiet shock, she didn't want to leave. The morning settled over the island like a thin veil of silver, the mist stretching low across the lake and drifting between the birch trunks. Mara stood outside the windmill, her breath painting small clouds in the cold air. The structure loomed above her, weathered, leaning, skeletal in places, yet somehow possessing a quiet, stubborn dignity. Its broken blades hung at odd angles, creaking faintly when the breeze shifted, as if the building itself sighed in its sleep. Inside, Liam's excited footsteps echoed on the wooden floorboards. He had been awake at dawn, unable to resist exploring every corner of the windmill. Mara followed him, the boards beneath her feet bowing and groaning as though the structure recognized unfamiliar weight. The interior was dust-covered, but not abandoned in the careless way of forgotten things. A lantern still stood on a tilted shelf. A kettle hung above a small iron stove. Tools were arranged on the wall in deliberate order, despite the years of disuse. Someone had once lived here with intention, not neglect. "Mom, look at this!" Liam called from the corner near the stairs. He held a small carved wooden boat in his hands, the wood smoothed by time and handling. Mara took it gently. The craftsmanship was simple but steady, the work of someone who understood how hands shape memory. She looked around again, really looked. The windmill's wide base held several workbenches. Old gears, rusty bolts, lengths of rope and timber filled the space like remnants of a life paused mid-motion. Dust hung heavy in the air, but beneath it she sensed something deeper. A lingering presence, a quiet endurance. "Let's check upstairs," she said. The narrow staircase groaned with each step. In the attic, the light was dimmer, filtering through a crack in one of the boards. Shadows stretched long across the piles of old nets, trunks, and crates. The smell here was stronger, dust mixed with something older, like dried herbs or old ink. Liam tugged open a small chest. Inside were fishing nets, a pocket knife, and a bundle wrapped in cloth. Mara lifted it carefully. The fabric unfurled with a powdery sigh, revealing a stack of letters tied with a blue string, faded almost white. Her heartbeat picked up. The handwriting on the envelope was precise, almost elegant. Her husband's name appeared on the front, written in firm strokes. She sank onto an old crate and slowly opened the first letter. Winter came early this year. The roof holds, though stiff winds shake the mill each night. The lake is beginning to freeze along the edges. She flipped to another. The storms have grown quieter. Sometimes I hear the creaking of the beams and imagine it is her footsteps again. I keep the mill standing for her. For us. I cannot sell this place. If I do, what remains of our life disappears forever. The words hit her with unexpected force. They were not just observations. They were confessions of a man hollowed by loneliness and clinging to the only memory he had left. Each sentence carried a weight that pressed into her chest. More letters followed, some describing the lake freezing in early autumn, others recounting repairs made to the mill, and others speaking of silence heavy enough to bruise. She paused, staring at the letters spread across her knees. For years, she had believed her husband came from a family fractured by pride, distance, and indifference. But the truth was more complicated, far more human. It wasn't bitterness that kept Severin here. It was love. A stubborn, unyielding love that refused to vanish in the face of grief. A small beam of sunlight broke through the crack in the wall, illuminating the dust like drifting stars. She felt something shift inside her, something quiet and fragile. "Mom?" Liam's voice was soft. Mara blinked away the fog in her eyes. "What is it?" "There's a shed behind the mill. Can we look?" She nodded and followed him down the stairs. Outside, the breeze stirred the birch leaves into a whisper. The shed stood crooked near the water, its roof sagging, its door half swallowed by vines. Inside, the smell of damp wood and earth mingled with the faint scent of oil. Tools hung neatly on the wall, though rust had claimed many. In a corner, half hidden beneath a tarp, lay a rolled bundle. Mara pulled it free. Dust billowed out as she unwrapped the edges. Blueprints, hand-drawn detailed sketches of the windmill from every angle. Measurements lined the edges. notes written in the same steady hand as the letters filled the margins. Calculations, instructions, plans. The mill drawn in these sketches looked tall, straight, strong, fully rebuilt. At the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that trembled slightly with age, Severin had written, "A windmill must endure solitude. Only then can it stand through storms." Mara swallowed, her throat tightening. She traced the lines on the blueprints with her fingertips. The mill was meant to be rebuilt, not abandoned. Liam peered over her shoulder. "Mom, can we fix it? The mill, like you wanted. We can try, right?" She turned toward him. His face was bright with hope and excitement, his cheeks flushed from the cold wind. He looked like a boy rediscovering the world piece by piece. She hesitated. She had never built anything bigger than a shelf. She knew nothing of carpentry, architecture, or reconstruction. The very idea of restoring a windmill felt absurd. But the letters weighed softly in her pocket. Severin's loneliness, his devotion, his need to anchor himself to the last piece of his life before everything fell apart, all of it lingered in the air. And then there was Liam, her son, who had spent the last 2 years shrinking into himself, now glowing with possibility. "Maybe we can," she whispered. "We can try." Liam grinned so wide it lit the whole shed. They stepped out into the cold air. The lake shimmered under the pale sky, and the windmill stood waiting tilted, ancient, patient. Mara walked to its base and placed her hand on the rough wood. It felt solid beneath her palm, worn but enduring. Behind her, Liam picked up a fallen branch and pretended it was a hammer. He swung it toward an old log with all the seriousness of a craftsman, his small form determined. Mara looked at the windmill again. At the letters, at the drawings. Maybe it wasn't about finishing what Severin started. Maybe it was about understanding why he stayed, why he never let the mill go, why he chose memory over convenience. She felt the wind tug at her hair, cold and clean. For the first time in years, there was something inside her that resembled purpose, not certainty, not peace, but the first faint spark of both. And the windmill leaning, broken, enduring, seemed to watch her with quiet approval, as though it had been waiting for someone to listen. The first true days of work began under a pale, early spring sun, the kind that offered light without warmth. Mara woke before Liam, stepping outside to find the island wrapped in a soft hush. The lake still as glass, the windmill standing like a lonely sentinel above the mossy clearing. She stared at it for a long moment, trying to imagine it the way Severin had drawn it in those yellowed blueprints. Tall, straight, its blades turning smoothly in the wind. In her mind it looked almost alive. When Liam emerged, rubbing sleep from his eyes, they shared a quiet breakfast of bread, apples, and the last of their instant coffee, its weak bitterness grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. The city felt distant now, unreal, as though she had stepped out of her own life and into someone else's memory. As the sun climbed higher, they gathered what tools they had found. A rusted axe, an old hammer with a cracked wooden handle, nails sealed in glass jars. The weight of the tools in her hands felt strange but welcome. Their first task was clearing the area around the mill. Fallen branches littered the ground, some rotted, others fresh from winter storms. Liam dragged the smaller limbs into a pile, grunting with effort. Mara worked at the larger ones, her palms burning as she struggled against the stubborn wood. With each successful swing, each broken branch, something inside her loosened. The rhythm of effort soothed her more than she expected. Sweat gathered on her temples, despite the cold. By midday, they had cleared enough space to see the mill fully for the first time, not as a relic lost to time, but as a structure that could be saved. The lower beams were warped, but the stone base remained solid. 2 of the 4 great blades hung at angles, broken where they met the central axle. Moss crept up the walls like ancient scars. Yet beneath all of it, there was a strength she couldn't deny. She ran her fingers over the wood and whispered without meaning to, "We can make you stand again." Liam, overhearing her, nodded with the seriousness of someone far older. "We will, Mom. It's ours now." They began reinforcing the weakest parts of the structure. Mara studied the blueprints, comparing the lines on the page to the beams before her. She felt clumsy, unsure, but gradually her movements grew more confident. She cut fallen logs into rough planks using the old saw from the shed. Liam held the end steady, his small arms trembling with the effort. They replaced the lowest crossbeams one at a time. The wood was heavy and awkward, but they managed, inch by inch. In the evenings, after the sun slipped behind the trees, they lit small fires near the water and cooked whatever they had: beans, rice, bread. Liam talked constantly, animated in a way she hadn't seen in years. He described the frogs he found by the shore, the patterns of ripples on the lake, his theories about how the mill once worked. She listened, sometimes quietly, sometimes smiling, letting his voice fill the spaces where grief once lived. Everything changed on the 5th day. The morning had started calm. A thin mist lingered over the lake, and the air was cool but gentle. They worked on reinforcing the inner support beams, both of them sweating despite the chill. Around noon the wind shifted suddenly, sharp, cold, carrying the scent of rain. Mara looked up. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon like a wall rising from the edge of the world. "We should stop for today," she said. "Storm's coming." But the windmill, half repaired, half broken, felt fragile. She didn't want to leave it exposed. She climbed the ladder to secure the loose tools and cover the half-finished work with a tarp. The wind picked up quickly, tugging at her clothes. Liam steadied the ladder below. By the time she climbed down, the storm had arrived. It came not with a slow build, but with violent suddenness. Wind howled through the birches, making them sway like thin dancers struggling to stay upright. Rain fell in sheets, drenching them within seconds. Thunder cracked, echoing across the lake with a force that made her wince. They ran for shelter inside the mill, slamming the door shut behind them. Inside, the mill creaked under the onslaught. The beams groaned. Dust rained from the ceiling. The sound of the storm infiltrated every corner of the structure. It was not outside, but inside, pressing against them with a wild, relentless fury. Then came the sound she feared most, a crack, sharp and violent. Wood splintering, something massive shifting. She froze. Liam clutched her sleeve. Mom. A second crack followed, louder, heavier. She dashed to the window, wiping fog from the glass with her sleeve. In the flicker of lightning, she saw it. One of the tall birch trees beyond the clearing, leaning at a dangerous angle, its roots partially exposed, the soil around it turning to mud. "Get back," she whispered. "Liam, back away from the walls." The tree groaned, the sound rising above even the storm. Then, with a deafening crash that shook the entire mill, the birch splintered and fell. Its trunk slammed onto the roof, crushing part of the newly reinforced section. Dust and fragments rained down. The mill groaned as though in pain. Liam yelped and grabbed her tightly. Mara wrapped her arms around him, heart pounding, breath trembling. The storm raged on, water seeping through the cracks, wind pushing against the weakened walls. She felt the old panic rising, the panic she had lived with since the day her husband died, the panic that told her nothing she touched could last. "We shouldn't have come," she said, her voice cracking. "We can't do this. I can't keep things together, not anymore." Liam looked up at her through trembling lashes. His face was pale, his hair soaked, but his eyes were steady in a way that made her chest ache. "But Mom, he didn't leave when things broke. Grandpa didn't give up. Why should we?" She stared at him. Lightning lit his face for a brief moment, wet, frightened, determined. And she realized something sharp and painful. He believed in her more than she believed in herself. The storm did not let up, but something inside her shifted. She stood, wiping rain from her brow. "Come on," she said. "If we don't clear the trunk, the whole roof could collapse." Together they pushed against the door until the wind relented enough for them to step outside. Rain hammered down, turning the ground to mud. The fallen birch lay across the roof, crushing the planks they had put up, heavy branches dangling like broken limbs. Mara grabbed a loose branch and heaved. Liam followed, digging his heels into the wet earth. The work was brutal. Cold rain soaked them to the bone. The wind nearly knocked them off balance. But piece by piece, they wrestled the branches away, dragging them across the clearing, freeing the roof from the worst of the weight. The moment the largest trunk rolled off the side of the mill and onto the ground below, Mara felt her breath finally seize in her chest. "We did it," Liam gasped. Not fixed, not repaired, but saved for now. When the storm finally weakened into a cold drizzle, the mill stood ragged but upright. The damage was real, but not fatal. It had survived. Back inside, they collapsed onto the dusty floor, soaking wet, shivering but alive. Liam leaned against her shoulder, his small body warm beneath the blanket she wrapped around them both. "Mom," he whispered, voice sleepy. "We didn't let it break." She rested her cheek against his hair. "No," she murmured. "We didn't." The truth settled into her like the slow warmth of a fire. They had fought the storm together. They had endured, and the mill-old fragile scarred had endured with them. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for. Strength, possibility, a beginning. Outside, the rain eased. The windmill creaked, but its silhouette remained against the gray sky, a structure battered but standing, much like the two of them. And in that moment, Mara knew, whatever came next, she would stand too. Summer arrived on the island not with heat, but with light, the kind of bright, unfiltered northern sunlight that lingered long past evening and painted the lake in shades of copper and pale gold. The worst storms had passed, the water lay calm, and for the first time since they arrived, Mara felt as though the island itself had exhaled. The windmill stood on the clearing with new posture, its repaired beams lighter in color than the old ones, its frame upright and steadier than before. It was still incomplete, still rough in places, but unmistakably alive. Days fell into a gentle rhythm. Mara rose with the sun, boiled water over their small makeshift stove, and watched the lake shimmer through the wavy glass of the mill's window. Liam, once exhausted by school and the city's noise, now burst out of the door each morning with boundless energy, racing to gather branches for the fire or explore the pebbled shore. He spoke more, laughed more, lived more. The island was stretching something inside him, open, something that had been closed far too long. Their progress on the windmill was slow but steady. With careful measurements and the help of Severn's fragile blueprints, Mara reinforced the inner support frame, replacing one weakened beam every few days. They scavenged driftwood from the shore and straight planks from the abandoned shed. They carried stones to reinforce the mill's base. They even rebuilt one of the giant blades, attaching it to the spindle with bolts scavenged from the workshop. It didn't spin, but it stood tall, straight, a promise of what the mill once had been. Every improvement brought a small, hard-earned satisfaction. The calluses on Mara's palms deepened, her shoulders ached each night. but each ache carried meaning. She began to understand Severn's letters, not the loneliness in them, but the way purpose had anchored him to the island. Work had not saved him, but it had given shape to his solitude. Now, it was giving shape to hers. The evenings were her favorite time. She and Liam sat on the small steps they had built at the mill's entrance, watching the lake shift from silver to gold to a deep, glassy blue. Some nights they cooked fish, usually tiny, barely enough for a meal over a fire of pine branches. Liam carved his little boats beside her, smoothing the wooden hulls with a small piece of sandpaper he had found in the shed. It was during one of these evenings that Mara saw something strange, a distant glint on the water, like sunlight bouncing off metal. She squinted. A faint buzzing followed, low at first, then growing louder. "Mom?" Liam asked, noticing her sudden stillness. Mara stood, shading her eyes. A speedboat. White, sleek, cutting across the lake with confidence, and a spray of water trailing behind it. The hum of its engine echoed between the trees. She felt a familiar knot tighten in her chest, the old sense of intrusion, of the outside world reaching in where it did not belong. Liam hurried to her side. "Who is that?" The boat slowed as it neared the island. A man stood at the helm, waving politely. He wore a gray jacket, crisp and clean, and sunglasses that hid his eyes. His shoes were far too polished for a place like this. When he docked the boat on the rocky shore and stepped out, the air around him seemed to shift. He didn't belong here, not to the wind, not to the lake, not to the mill. His presence felt like a sharp edge cutting through the island's quiet. "Mrs. Mara," he called as he approached. His voice carried a smooth, professional tone. "Good evening. I hope I'm not intruding." Mara's posture stiffened. "Can I help you?" He stopped a few steps before her, opening a leather briefcase that gleamed with fresh polish. "My name is Mr. Hart. I represent a development company based in the city. We're expanding several recreational areas around the northern lakes. For years, we tried to contact the owner of this island, Mr. Severin, I believe. Unfortunately, he was difficult to reach." He offered a thin, polite smile. "When we heard the inheritance had passed on, I wanted to speak with you personally. This island, Mrs. Mara, is incredibly valuable real estate." Liam's fingers curled tightly around Mara's sleeve. She rested her hand on his shoulder. "We're not interested," she said quietly. The man chuckled softly, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone used to hearing no from people who didn't yet understand their own interests. "I completely understand the sentimental attachment," he said. "Places like this can feel meaningful, even enchanting, but from a practical perspective." He paused, pulling out a set of documents. "The offer we can provide is substantial, enough to buy a home in the city, enough to give your son access to proper schooling, medical care, stability. I assume living here long-term would be challenging." He gestured subtly toward the windmill, its patched beams and mismatched boards. "This structure is collapsing," he added. "It would cost far more to restore it than what it's worth." Mara felt a flicker of something sharp anger, or maybe protectiveness, rise in her chest. Liam stepped forward. "It's not collapsing." The man blinked, surprised. "I'm sure it feels that way to you. Children often grow attached to—" "Sir," Mara's voice was calm but firm. "We're not selling." Mr. Hart inhaled slowly, the polite mask cracking just enough for her to glimpse impatience beneath it. "Mrs. Mara, please think carefully. Your situation has changed. You're raising a son alone. You're working part-time. This island is a burden you didn't ask for. Let me remove it from your shoulders." Her jaw tightened. "This place isn't a burden." He lifted a brow. "Even with winter coming." Her heart skipped. "Yes, winter. cold, snow, survival. But then she looked at the windmill, their windmill, and the work they had done. She looked at the clearing they had cleaned, the repaired beams, the blueprint pinned above her makeshift workbench. She looked at Liam, whose eyes had regained light she hadn't seen since before her husband passed. The city had given them survival. The island gave them life. "This is our home," she said, steady. "We're not interested." Mr. Hart closed his briefcase with a soft click, the sound sharp against the stillness of the island. "I see," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't. "If you change your mind, my card is in the packet. I'll leave you to your project." He walked back to his boat, climbed aboard, and sped away. The engine's roar faded across the lake until only the soft lapping of water remained. Liam let out a quiet breath. "Mom, you won't sell it, right?" She knelt beside him. "No, sweetheart. We're staying. This place matters." Later that evening, when the sky turned violet and the moon rose in the quiet, Mara went inside the mill and sifted through Severn's letters again. At the very bottom of the box, she found one she had missed, a smaller envelope, addressed in trembling handwriting, "To whoever stays." Her breath caught as she opened it. "If you are reading this, then you understand. This land is not kept by ownership, but by memory. People will tell you to trade that memory for comfort. Do not listen. If you choose to stay, build something that can stand even when you are alone. Build with love, and it will endure." Mara pressed the letter to her chest. Outside, she heard Liam humming softly as he whittled a small piece of driftwood. She stepped outside, watching him in the dusky light, the lake reflecting gold around him. He didn't notice her watching. The windmill loomed behind them, still battered, still imperfect, still standing. And Mara knew with absolute clarity what Severn had felt all those years. Some places hold you not because you own them, but because they remember you. This island remembered. And she would too. Autumn crept across the island slowly, then all at once. One morning the birch leaves appeared tinged with gold. A week later, the entire clearing glowed as if someone had dusted every tree with sunlight. The air grew sharper, carrying the scents of smoke, earth, and cold water. Frost painted pale patterns on the grass at dawn. And through all of it, the windmill stood patched, uneven, stubbornly upright, a gathering of old scars and new beginnings knitted together by their hands. Mara woke each morning with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not exactly, something quieter, deeper. Purpose. She would rise before Liam, pull on a sweater still holding the faint smell of wood smoke, and light the small stone stove they had built together. The fire crackled softly. Its warmth filled the base of the windmill, flickering against the rough wooden walls, illuminating the knots and grains of timber like veins beneath skin. Liam always appeared a few minutes later, hair rumpled, cheeks pink from sleep. He would slip onto the bench beside her, legs swinging above the floor, and lean into her shoulder. They spoke little in the mornings. They didn't need to. The island had taught them a new language, silence that felt full instead of empty. Their days were spent finishing the restoration. Mara used the last solid beams from the shed to reinforce the inner frame. Together they laid smooth planks for the floor, sanding each one until it fit snugly into place. They sealed cracks with resin gathered from the pines, their fingers sticky with sap by midday. They hung curtains cut from old sheets, the fabric fluttering like pale wings in the wind that threaded through the mill's windows. A small wooden table, assembled from driftwood and scavenged nails, stood beneath the tallest window, where the light pooled brightest. The hardest task was the final blade. The first one they built in summer had been crude but sturdy, a symbol more than a functioning piece. But now, with autumn whispering of approaching winter, Mara wanted the final blade to be strong enough to make the windmill whole again, even if it never turned. The blade was long and heavy, a mosaic of wood pieces scavenged from the island and shaped with patient hands. She carved each edge with care, Liam sanding the surfaces with determination. It took 3 days to hoist it into place. They built a makeshift pulley using ropes found in the shed and a thick branch lodged between 2 birches. The blade swung in the crisp air like a slow pendulum as they guided it upward. Mara's muscles burned, her palms blistered, but she didn't waver. Liam, perched safely behind her, shouted encouragements with breathless excitement. When the blade finally locked into place beside the first, Mara stepped back, chest heaving, and looked up. The windmill wasn't symmetrical. It wasn't elegant. It bore mismatched wood, crooked supports, and 100 visible flaws. But it stood proud, whole. It carried the weight of every hour they had worked, every storm they had endured, every memory that had brought them here. Liam exhaled in a whisper. "It's beautiful." Mara felt warmth spread through her chest. "Yes," she said. "It is." In the following days, they prepared for winter. They stacked firewood beneath a tarp near the mill's base. Liam helped build a small woodpile inside, arranging the logs into neat rows. Mara crafted a storage shelf and placed jars of dried herbs inside. She patched the largest gaps in the walls with cloth and resin. The roof, reinforced with layers of new planks, held firm even when the wind howled. One afternoon, while sorting tools in the corner of the mill, Mara felt the urge to revisit Severn's letters. She spread them across the floor, their fragile pages trembling in the draft. Each letter felt heavier, now that she understood the man who wrote them, not as a ghost haunting the island, but as someone who had clung to purpose, the way she now clung to hers. At the bottom of the pile, she found the smaller envelope again. "To whoever stays." She read it once more, then folded the page carefully. Her gaze drifted to the stone stove. A panel of the wall just behind it had a narrow gap, barely wide enough for a jar. She realized then what she needed to do. Later that night, after Liam had fallen asleep, wrapped in blankets beside the fire, Mara took an empty glass jar from the shelf and sat at the small table beneath the window. She opened the worn notebook she had found weeks earlier and began to write. Her handwriting was uneven at first. She hesitated between sentences, unsure of how to capture everything the island had given back to her. But gradually, the words came. She wrote about the storms they survived, the beams they lifted, the quiet mornings, the laughter, the ache, the healing. She wrote about memory, about belonging, about Severn, about herself, and she wrote about Liam, how the island had breathed life back into him, how he ran barefoot through the clearing with joy she feared she would never see again. Her final sentence came easily, without thought. "This place may be small, and the winter's hard, but if you give to it, it gives everything back." She folded the pages, slid them into the jar alongside Severn's letter, sealed it tightly, and placed it in the narrow space behind the stove. She covered the opening with a plank, pressing it firmly until it looked like part of the wall. The windmill now held their memory too. That night Mara stepped outside. The moon hung low over the lake, bright and cold. The water mirrored its glow, turning the world into an endless tapestry of silver. The wind carried the scent of pine and smoke, rustling through the birch leaves. Somewhere deep in the forest, an owl called, its voice echoing softly across the dark. She sat on the steps of the mill, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The wooden structure creaked occasionally, adjusting to the night air, but it was a comforting sound, like the mill was breathing beside her. Footsteps approached lightly. "Mama," Liam murmured, sleepy-eyed, leaning against the doorframe. "It's cold. Come here." She held the blanket open, and he slid beside her, resting his head against her arm. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the steady rhythm of the lake brushing the shore. The night wasn't silent. It was alive, filled with small sounds that had become as familiar as their own heartbeat. After a while, Liam whispered, "We'll be ready for winter, right?" Mara kissed the top of his head. "Yes, we will." The windmill rose above them, scarred, imperfect, and absolutely theirs. The island had once belonged to a man who held on to memory because he had nothing else left. Now it belonged to a woman and her son who were learning to build new memories of their own, not perfect memories, not without pain, but strong enough to stand through solitude. When dawn finally brushed the lake with pale light, Mara closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The air was cold, sharp, and real. She realized she didn't feel like a visitor anymore. This was home, their beginning, their inheritance, not of land, but of strength. And as the first birds woke and the windmill cast its long shadow across the clearing, Mara knew without doubt the island had chosen them. And they had chosen it back. If this story moved you, support it. Leave a like and subscribe. Comment which city you're watching from and whether you want more stories like this. Thank you for watching. The next video is already waiting for you.